Welcome, everyone. This is a lecture on contactless radio and health. So what we have seen until now is the devices that we wear have sensors that can tell us a lot about our health. They give an idea, for example, of our breathing and our heart rate, and this can be measured through features that can be used on machine learning classifiers. In this lecture, we are talking about radios and signals that can be interpreted, but they are originated by devices that are not on our body. So in particular, we'll talk about something that looks very much like radar or sonar. The ability of this sort of radio signal to bounce off bodies and objects at different speed and intensity can be used to understand the position of objects and individuals, and also, surprisingly, physiological signals and markers of our health, in particular respiration and heart rate. So in this picture, I have a bat that is famous for using this sort of property to move in space instead of using sight. Differently from the bat, in this case, the radio antennas won't be located on us, on the bat itself. Will be something in the environment that reflects on our body and then can get information about our physiological markers. So radio reflection is certainly not a new concept. Radar base stations existed, and by using the transmission of a signal, which is then reflected by the object, bounced back by the object, they would measure something about the object, in particular distance. So how can this be used for our health, and what are the challenges? Well, first of all, we have very small devices that often have their battery power, so power could be an issue. So obviously, these antennas that transmit and receive the signal need to be efficient, so that they can be carried by these devices if we were to embed the antenna inside the devices. Likewise, though, if these devices need to be in our environment, they could be possibly powered, but again, they should be small, and the antenna can't be, a dish, can be large, and they need to be possibly mounted to a wall as well. Because we are dealing with situations where these radios need to be close to our bodies, the radio frequencies need to be acceptable for our health and our body, and we know that some radio frequencies are really not. So this is an important aspect to be considered. And then the next question is, can we really use them to meaningfully detect aspects of our health? Challenges and things to think about is, well, this technology, unlike imaging, where if you have a camera in a room observing an individual, the image of the individual can be quite clear. However, this can't go through walls, so you can't have a single camera that could work for example, for a care home that has multiple rooms. You'd have to have multiple cameras in different rooms. And it turns out that this sort of technology instead has the ability of going through walls, and also can be exploited for that. Then the next question is, can we really have meaningful health detection of physiology for multiple users and not just one user? What happens if you have multiple users? This confusing the system. And although we won't talk much about that, I can already point you to solutions that are starting to solve these aspects of multiple users, so they're able to distinguish the different users. And so how can we detect the object and the distance? Well, we've seen already in the location lecture that we would use with the satellite, with GPS-like systems. You would in fact use the time and the speed of light to understand distance. So in an ideal world, you have the reflection time, which is this blue plus the purple. So you know the time of transmission and you know the time of receival because you're at the same base station. So you can calculate that reflection time, multiply by the speed of light, and you have the distance. Now, the problem with this is that for the distances that we are considering, such as a room, these distances, these delta differences are very small with respect to the speed of light. And the kind of devices that are commodity devices that we could have in such room wouldn't have the level of clock able to really detect this delta, or it would be very expensive to have those. And therefore, other techniques have been developed. So most of what I'll tell you today is based on work by people at MIT. In particular, there's a reference to a PhD thesis at the bottom here that can be used if you want to really know more. So the clever idea here is to use a different way to find this reflection time, this as we call it, delta t. And that's based on using frequency changes. So imagine you have a device that is transmitting at a certain frequency. Let's say that your radar station, your device, is transmitting a certain frequency, but with the increase of time, that frequency of transmission changes. So at time t, I transmit the frequency at 0. And then I have a linear formula to transform the frequency. So whenever I need to transmit a wave at time t1, I would have transmitted the frequency that is linearly dependent to the frequency I transmitted t0. But it's not the same. It's a different frequency. So what we know is that if you look at this graph, at time t, I transmit the wave, and I know I transmitted the perhaps frequency f. And then when this transmitted wave comes back, so if I'm going back a couple of slides, when this wave comes back, the time of receipt, I don't know, I can't measure the time difference very well. This delta t is unknown because my clock is not good enough for that. It comes back really quickly, let's say. But what I know is that at the time that this comes back, I am transmitting at a different frequency. I know the frequency I'm transmitting now. And therefore, I can easily calculate that delta f, the difference of frequency of this wave and the frequency of at which when this wave comes back, I would be transmitting at if I have to send out a wave. And this difference of frequency is cleverly calculated by multiplying the wave with a function and using DFT. And the details are left for you to look up in the paper. But the idea is that, I know the formula in which I change the frequency and I know the slope of this curve. And I know delta f, therefore I can calculate delta t. And this is, the idea that is used to calculate those differences. So essentially to do this without having very, very precise clocks. So in addition to distance, we might need to calculate position. And again, this is something we've seen when we talked about GPS. You could triangulate by using multiple base stations. So in general, in this domain, there are problems that need solving. One of them is the static multipath or multiple object, the fact that if you have a user in a room, you might want just the information about the user and not the information about the various objects. Turns out that if you're trying to, for example, detect the physiological aspects of a human being in a room like this, the reflection of the chair won't have information about the chair's breathing or the chair heart rate, so the signals can be differentiated. There are other difficulties related to dynamic multipath of other things in the room, for example, movement of other people, and people themselves, as well as air conditioning, wind, and all these other aspects. We won't talk much about that, but some of the papers I'm referring to obviously have to solve these problems to make the approach realistic. And as I said before, if you are trying to use the system to detect multiple people, then you will need to also consider that challenge. Now here I would like to show you an episode of a series called Big Bang Theory. Some of you might know, and this is episode of series 10, episode 14 of series 10, that uses as an example the technology that was developed that I'm just going to describe. So first I will stop sharing and then reshare a particular example for you. Let's try this. There we go. And then I will now play it for you.
Hey, Leonard, if you're happy and you know it, no need to clap your hands because I have an emotion detector.
How's it working out?
Yeah, surprisingly well.
That's great. I'm happy for you.
No, what? Hold on. What you are, aren't you sweet?
And so I'm going to start sharing the screen again with our presentation. Okay, so you know, the box that was displayed by Sheldon in the in the episode is the idea of this box that pointed to someone is able to detect emotions. So it's not about just physiology. We know that in affective computing, heart rate and respiration signal can be linked to physiological signal that go beyond the basic and can detect emotions. So in this particular work, and I'm citing at the bottom, they went from this kind of radio signal to emotions. And for this, they use, you know, this is the wave that comes from the device. And you can detect very easily, even by the time features, even in the time domain of the breathing cycles. What you cannot possibly detect is that there are also little bumps here that are related to the heart rate of the person. And here is just by an illustration, you know, an ECG signal that you wouldn't have when you have this wave, but in reality, you would be able, by, as I was exemplifying a few slides time, be able to detect these bumps as well to undetect their heart rate interbeat interval. And for monitoring respiration, really what they do is, if you have your base station, you measure the distance of the inhale, which is different from the distance of exhale. And that's the idea of the respiration. In fact, here, you know, the signal notices this exhale and inhale. And so in their paper, they use the signal and extrapolate respiration features from the signal. We'll see which ones then decide to use. So they do a feature selection because they get many. They also find a way to detect the heartbeat cycles by segmenting it and then look at features, obviously, IBI feature, interbeat interval features that can reveal things such as heart rate variability, which is highly related, for example, to stress. And so this is the input signal, and we've said that you know, you can even see how for the time domain you can get the inhale and exhale, and then how do we detect the heartbeats? They use the second derivative of, this is the second derivative of that signal, and they highlight that just by eye, if here I'm trying to give you an intuition, there is a pattern, a cycle that can be, you know, there's quite a lot of noise in this, but at least the cycle, the pattern, that the heart rate can be segmented, and by segmenting the heart rate, you are able then to detect feature interbeat interval. Here are the list of features that they use. The ones related to that are then selected for the work best for interbeat interval are in bold, while the respiration features are in italic. I highlight, in fact, that some of the features, if you remember our analysis in audio and in PPG of heart rate signal, you might recognize certain names. So, for example, this is one that measures the differences of more than 50 milliseconds in consecutive regular heartbeats. And we've used it before. It's a signal that is used in heart rate variability. They use power spectrum density measures, low and high frequency measures. The Poincaré plot we also saw when we consider PPG signal, and these are just standard deviations on the two diagonals of the Poincaré plots. We haven't talked about sample entropy and some other of these features. If you're interested, you can go and read a bit about this. But essentially, these features are the ones used to then recognize emotions. But let's talk a little bit about the precision of this method. So, for example, the detection of interbit interval, the curve looked a bit weird and we were suspicious, would it work? Well, in their experiment, it looks like in average, so for 50% of the samples, they have a 0.4% IRB rate. And for about, I would say, 80, 90%, they have less than 1. And so this is what an emotion model would look like. There are generally 4 big classes of emotion, depending on not just the positivity and the negativity, but also the level of excitement of the emotion. So obviously you would imagine that very high excitement, positive emotion would be joy, while a low excitement and negative emotion would be sadness. And so they had an experiment where they considered 12 subjects, asked the user to prepare personal memories to evoke emotions, and then they had the user elicit this memory so that they had the user having that emotion. Sometimes psychologists also use movies or particularly intense videos to elicit this emotion. And then they use the classifier to classify the emotion, a little bit like Sheldon, like pointing a device onto a person and understand how they felt. And the ground truth was a self-reported emotion of the person. So not super reliable, but I guess best possible ground truth. So when they used the classifier only a single individual, they were able to achieve 92%. So if I have enough data to train on data from that individual, I would be able to detect it reasonably well. But having enough data from the same person is obviously, we know it's actually quite difficult. So when you try to train on different people, so leave one out model and test on a different person, well, you would have the accuracy obviously goes down because they're not all like you. You will have more variability, and this is a well-known factor, but still a 72% accuracy on the detection of emotions through the system, which is reasonably high. The hardware they have is simply similar to this, and this is the level of frequencies that they use. Their power is quite good, so they probably don't need to be, they could be battery powered in a way. And the second part, so we've seen how this was used for emotions, and instead I will also talk about how this was used for sleep posture monitoring. So you see in the picture another example of a device. This is again a paper from that is cited below that has this device. This device is sitting in a room, so again, it's not on the person, it's not a mobile device. And it can be used to monitor posture. Posture is important in various health-related situations, avoiding bed sores after surgery, reducing sleep apnea, because if you sleep in a certain position, you're more prone to it, progression of Parkinson's disease, alerting an epilepsy patient, or potentially fatal sleep postures. And so what's the idea? Well, again, I think I hinted at this. If you have an individual on their bed and there's a device in the room, there will be reflections that come directly from objects in the room that can be excluded because they won't be modulated by breathing. They won't be live aspects. Some of these might be challenging because they might be moving, so this thing might be moving and having a different signal every time. And so that, this is dynamic, but still perhaps a modulation of the breathing would be difficult to, would be easy to distinguish. There wouldn't be any modulation of breathing. In terms of the user, there will be signals coming back with direct path, but there will also be signals bouncing off other surfaces before getting to the user. But there will be stable conditions. So when the person is sleeping, they would be in a sequence of stable positions, and therefore there be this might be possibly detected. And you would have enough data for this periods of time to find this direct and indirect path. And I find this picture very revealing in a way. And in fact, it's a picture of the signal over, let's say, a spectrogram when the user is facing up and when the user is facing towards the device. Here on the x-axis, you have distance, and here you have the angle at which the signal is arriving to the device, which is also measured, can also be measured. And so you see that these two spectrograms are different. When the user is facing towards the device, you would have most of the signal concentrated here. When the user is facing, there's a lot of, facing up is a lot of reflection, indirect reflection, and this can be seen from the signal. And so if you imagine that you have a lot of data from a user about all their nights of sleep, then you might be able to train a classifier, even a deep learning classifier in this case, which is something they've done. So this is 4 layers. It's a dense classifier because they mention in their work that CNNs are very good with images such as this, but they usually are good at allowing pixels to be compared in a neighborhood rather than compared generally in over the overall picture. So it looks like in this case, a fully connected network is working better for this kind of scenario. So if you do have a lot of data from a single user, you might be able to train one of these. But the idea here is that they would like a system that is able to have very little data from a user and a lot of data to train a general model. And in fact, the paper goes quite a length to describe aspects that allow them to having a transfer learning approach, in fact, the domain adaptation work that assumes that you have very limited data from a target user. In fact, in the worst case in the analysis, they have about 16 minutes of data. So this kind of calibration data. They have a lot of data from other users, which is labeled. So they have a lot of this. And then they do something very approximate. They look at the data from the target user, but not the label data, just the data itself. And they compare it with all the source users. And they use the data that looks most similar to the user to augment the target data for the user. And so by using this data, they are able to generally improve the model. The way they do this is that they adapt a general model trained on all source users to the target data and the augmented target data, and they use a majority voting to choose the best of the model. So so these models are trained on each of the source users, and then they adapt this to the target data augmented with the data that was most similar to this. And then they use a majority voting to choose the model that is best for this user. You can read most of the details there, but this is an interesting application in case of having little data. And I wanted to show you their performance. And so here is the error, angular error, and the accuracy of their approach reported. They have compared with various classifier, KNN, random forest, XGB classifier, both by using various levels, so just the target user data and all of the user data. Obviously, if you only have 1 week of data, 1 night of data, 16 minutes of data, their approach works better also in the case of just 16 minutes of data, while the other approaches kind of collapse when you have limited data because of their transfer learning approach working across the user. So there are other things can be monitored, obviously beyond emotions and sleep postures. And we've seen examples of sleep stages monitoring PPG. Things about how you move in a room can be monitored. They have a use case on a Parkinson's disease patient's movement room, if you want to read, and stress in general, so beyond emotions. But I also want to highlight that we have looked at one specific type of ways of using these signals, this radio signals. But there are other approaches where audio has been used. So in this particular paper, smart speakers have been used in the same way as kind of radar transmitted devices to monitor heart rhythm. So you have, instead of your Wi-Fi base station or body compass base stations I described, they are using smart speakers and they emit audio, unaudible audio, and they bounce it over the bodies, and then they get the signal back. So there are other types of ways that can be used with the same idea that I've described here, and I would encourage you to read these works too. So thank you very much. I will stop recording. Bye.